Have you ever wanted to try making something from leather but felt like it was too complicated? It doesn't have to be, and for that, a belt is a perfect beginner project. You only need a few tools for a basic version, but I will also show you some extra options to make it as fancy as you want, breaking down all the steps and the tools involved. If you like your information in text or you want some help with the layouts for where to punch holes, I also created a worksheet which you can download for free at the link below. It also includes checklists for tools and the extra options. So what do we need to make a belt? The most obvious and important part is of course the leather. The very quick answer to this is that this type of project will work best with a vegetable tanned leather of 8 to 12 ounces, which is 3.2 to 4.8 millimeter. But let me elaborate on that. The two most used types of leather are vegetable tanned leather and chrome tanned leather. These two treatments will give two very different end products. Vegetable tanned leather is often called veg tan, and this is the leather most used for carving, tooling and sturdy projects like shoes or even saddles. The treatment leaves the top layer pliable, so it can be wetted and worked into shapes. I will use non-dyed veg tan for this project, but you can also get veg tan leather pre-dyed. But do note, pre-dyed leather will give you fewer options for carving. So get natural if you want to carve and dye, and get whichever color you want if you don't want to carve and if you want to skip a dyeing step. Then there is chrome tan, which is pretty much what you see is what you get. You cannot carve or dye this very well. But it does result in a very nice and supple and smooth leather. And this is very suited for things like clothing, furniture and bags. You can use chrome tan for this belt project, but it will give you less customization options and result in a less sturdy end product. I can mostly recommend this if what you're planning to make is more of a fashion belt that doesn't need to carry any weight. To be sure, I also want to mention PU leather and genuine leather. Do not get these are not suited for these types of projects. PU leather isn't even leather at all. It's various fabrics and plastics layered to look like leather. And genuine leather is a fashion term for pretty much the lowest quality of leather you can get. Yes, there might be some leather in there, but they are either the inferior layers of a hide or leather scraps mixed with a bonding agent and given the appearance of leather again. Both these types will deteriorate very quickly and they don't have the properties that we need for this project. If this was a bit much and you are still doubting, never hesitate to contact or ask the shop that you are going to buy from. Explain what you want to make with the leather and they will be able to point you to the right thing. The other material that we need is a buckle. The most important part about choosing a buckle is that the inside of the buckle determines the width of your belt. For a regular belt, I'd recommend one with an inner width between 3 and 4 cm. You can choose any design you'd like. The other option is to use a ring instead of a buckle. Most steps for a belt like that are similar, but to not make this video too long, I'll put the details on how to make a ring belt in the worksheet. Aside from that, we will need a few tools. Which you need exactly will very much depend on the options that you choose for your belt, so I'll show it if things are optional. But irregardless of what you go for, you will need at least something to cut the leather with. The easiest of this is an X-Acto knife, but you can also get dedicated leather knives or even a dedicated belt cutter. You'll need a hammer and a hole punch in the size that fits over the prong of your buckle. You'll need a ruler. If you're careful, you can use plastic, but I recommend a metal one. You'll want a sharp awl, sewing thread, and 2 needles. And a safety mat to protect your work surface while cutting. These 7 items are the minimum, but you can go all out with carving, stampings, and dyeing. I'll mention the additional items when explaining the options, and they're also listed in the worksheet. There are 2 main measurements that we need for the belt. The first is the width, which is determined by the buckle. For the length of the belt, you want to put on the clothes that you'll be wearing the belt with. Then measure around yourself at the height that you want to wear your belt at. I prefer to wear belts just below the waist, so that's where I measure. But if you prefer to wear them at hip height, it will need to be a bit longer, so you measure there. If you don't have a tape measure, you can use a string and then measure the length of that against the ruler. Then it's time to draw the 2 templates or patterns needed for this project. We will start at the end without the buckle. To make sure your belt is adjustable, we want to have multiple holes, of which your measurement is not the maximum or the minimum length. So the measurement you just took around yourself would be the middle option. And then I'll add adjustment holes every 2 centimeters. I like to add at least 7 adjustment options, so 3 in front and 3 after the 77 centimeters I just measured. But if you're going to wear this over various thicknesses of clothing, or you fluctuate a lot in sizes, you could add more. Then from the last hole I added another 5 centimeters to the end of the belt and have it end in a point. But this is another creative bit. Make it more or less pointy or even round, whatever you like. For the other side where the buckle will be inserted, you can add 6 centimeters after your measurement. This bit can be folded over later so your buckle can be kept in its place. And if you want to go for an optional keeper, which is the little loop you can tuck the rest of your belt in, this 6 centimeters is plenty for that as well. And that's all for this end. So to summarize the total belt length, this is your measurement plus 6 centimeters for the buckle side, and in my case 11 centimeters on the pointy side, which is for the adjustment points after the middle one and the belt end, which for me comes to a total length of 94 centimeters. And with this, we have our basic belt sizes, and we can get started with the exciting but very scary bit of cutting the leather. If you want, you can start by making a paper pattern. Trace your templates onto some paper in which the middle adjustment hole and the middle line of the buckle are at your measured distance. This is optional. I'll be showing it without the paper pattern. When you first unroll the leather, you want to check for any imperfections and spots you do not want to end up in your belt. Leather is a natural product, so imperfections happen, and we want to work around them. It is possible you need a longer belt than what fits on the leather, especially if you're making a ring belt. In this case, cut your belt in half and add 5 to 7 centimeters to one side, so we have 2 belt pieces to cut. Then grab your tape measure or length of string and find a logical place to cut your belt from. Contrary to fabric, leather does not have a straight grain, so the exact position doesn't matter too much. Start by putting either your paper pattern or one half of the template onto the leather and trace the outline with the awl. You don't have to press too hard, you just need a slightly visible line. If you're using the templates to trace onto the leather, extend the edges of the template until you have the length that you need and trace the other half of the template. Do make sure to measure the width of the traced belt in multiple places to make sure the edges are still parallel. Then onto the cutting. For this you want your knife as sharp as possible, so either sharpen it, or if you're using an X-Acto, snap the blade so you have a fresh edge. Do this every time you feel the edge becoming blunt again. To cut the leather, grab your ruler, line it up with the marking and cut along the line. Try to keep your blade as straight as possible to avoid cutting at an angle. You don't have to press too hard. It's better to need a few passes and get a nicely straight line, rather than to try and cut it in one go, but go askew. This might also be a good moment to know the general rule when working with leather. Any marking or cut you make is permanent. So work carefully and precisely, and your work will look a lot more professional. When cutting outside corners, you can extend the cut a bit. This way, the corners end up nice and crisp, and it's easier to cut. After cutting the first pass, I personally put away the ruler and cut along the earlier passes, but try and see what works best for you. And another tip, if you see random half circles appear on your leather, check your nails, you might want to trim them. If you want to add a keeper, it can often be cut from a piece that's left over after cutting your belt. I like a width of 1.5 centimeters. And for the length of the keeper, you want to take twice the width of your belt plus 3 centimeters. Keep the other cut off pieces of leather around, they will be very useful later. In general, untreated leather is very easily affected by the sun, so whenever you're not working on your piece, keep it out of the sun and preferably even cover with something like a cloth. For the buckle we need a hole where the prong goes. For this, we can mark 1 centimeter on each side of the end of your belt measurement for a total hole of 2 centimeters. And poke slight indents into the markings with your awl. I also like to trace the midline between the markings. We can do the same on the other end for the adjustment holes. Then center the hole punch over the mark. If you're very careful, you can lightly press on the hole punch to make a very faint mark to check how well it's centered. If you only make a slight mark, you can realign it and the mark won't be visible afterwards. We can do the same on the buckle end, but this time, line up the outer edge of the hole punch with the mark on the leather. Time for some whacking. If you're working on a table, try to work above a table leg. This works best on a solid surface you don't mind damaging. I use a block of hardwood. To protect your hole punch, place a piece of scrap leather on top of the surface. Then position the belt on top of that. Line up the hole punch and with 3 to 4 solid whacks, the hole should be punched. Try not to whack too hard either. You don't want to go through the scrap piece of leather. Do this for all the adjustment holes and the 2 marks at the buckle end. Then we can finish the hole for the buckle prong. Put the ruler as close to the edge of the 2 holes as possible and carefully cut between them. You might want to rotate the leather a few times to not accidentally cut too much. And that's it for the basic prep work. And now we're getting to the first big optional step. Do you want to add some carving? Carving and tooling is a whole big subject on its own. So in this video, I'll just be going over some basics and I'll link a more in-depth carving tutorial in the description. This is one of those things you can keep as simple or go as complex as you want. On the first belt I ever made, I decided to add just a little stamp between each adjustment hole. But it's also possible to go all out with floral patterns or basket weave. For the one I'm making here, I decided to challenge myself with the very scary idea of partially freehanding a wood pattern. No idea how that will turn out, but it will enable me to explain the basics of carving and tooling to you. If you just want a few stamps like my first belt, then you'll need a stamp that you like, a spray bottle or a sponge and a container for clean water, and cling film. That's it. If you also want to carve, then you'll also need a carving knife, a polishing compound and scrap leather or a stropping board, and beveler tools. After this, everything is optional. You can go for shaders to add background texture, sculpting spoons, leather lifters, embossing wheels. Honestly, this is the part of the hobby that you can sink all of your money in, because there is always just one more tool that you really need. This is something you definitely want to practice. So grab a scrap piece of leather and start by running it under the tap until it has fully changed color on both sides. Then you can set it aside to let it dry a bit. It should return closer to the original color. Still feel cold to the touch, but not wet. Then once again, the importance of sharp tools. Rub some polishing compound on the flesh side of some scrap leather or on a stropping board and sharpen your carving knife. I do this 10 times on each side. Always do this before starting to carve anything. Then you can start practicing. First, start with some straight lines. You want to keep your knife as straight as possible or the cuts will end up wide and wonky. Don't press too hard. The knife should glide smoothly through the top layer of the leather, not cut it fully. If this is difficult, you might need to sharpen it more. Again, I'll link a full carving tutorial in the description that goes into much more detail. I drew some practice template for the wood knots, so I'm trying those on the scrap piece too. If you put your paper template on the leather and carefully trace them with a regular pen, it will copy the lines to the leather. I like using a regular pen, so I can see on the paper which lines I did and did not trace yet. If you are setting the leather aside for any amount of time, wrap it in cling film so it doesn't dry out. Preferably do as much of the tooling in one go, but it can take a while and things like lunch and dinner definitely have to happen as well. Then we can get started on carving the actual belt. Once again, wet it under the tap. From this moment onwards, the leather will become very pliable and easy to stretch, so be very careful with it. Then we have to wait. It can take anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours until the leather is dry enough again. It might not be the most visible here, but when you touch the leather and see wet spots, it is still too wet. If you start carving now, the leather won't take indents too well and it will spring back into shape, which is a waste of your effort. Once it is dry enough, cover the bits you aren't going to be working on and start tracing your pattern. I decided to draw the wood knots on paper and then freehand the rest of the wood grain lines. If you're doing all of this in one go, it won't really be necessary, but if you had to leave for a longer period of time and your leather has dried out a bit, you can re-wet it with some clean water from a spray bottle. And this is just some carved lines, but I think it already looks pretty neat. Which brings us to the stamping. I quickly want to mention tool sets. Yes, you can get an all-in-one tool set from Amazon, AliExpress or Temu, but I noticed that there definitely is a quality difference. These first two are from such a set. The third is bought separately. For solid shapes like this, it can still be a valid choice, but for things like shaders, it can make a huge difference. So in the end, it might be worth it to get one or two actually good stamps rather than buying a large set of mediocre ones. Then grab a beveler tool and put the heel of the tool inside or as much as possible against the carved line, on the outside edge of the pieces you want to appear in front or on top. You can either put the tool down, give it a tap with the hammer, carefully move it so it overlaps slightly with your previous stamp and tap again, or you can try to glide it along the edge while continuously tapping. You want to get an even indent where you can't see the individual stamp marks. Then you can grab the shader and in pretty much the same way stamp it all along the edge you just beveled. This gives it more depth and makes the 3D effect even more apparent. After testing it on a scrap piece, you can move to your actual piece. Start on a bit that won't be very visible, such as the bit that will eventually be folded under the buckle, and start tapping away. I also opted to do some extra smoothing and minor details with a sculpting spoon between the beveling and the shading, but this is optional. This is a bit that, depending on the thing you're tooling, can take quite a while. The pattern I made took most of the afternoon and a bit of the evening, but it is a very satisfying and awesome bit of the craft, as you can see it transform and come alive under your hands. After all the wood knots, I also decided to bevel and shade some of the long wood grain bits, but not all of them for a natural and varying look. And lastly, I also applied a few carvings to the keeper. A small optional step, but one that does make it look a lot neater, is to bevel the edges with an edge beveler. The idea is to take off the sharpest corners, so later on, when we burnish them, they become extra smooth, round and shiny. If you're using a thicker leather, you can also do this on the backside, but that isn't needed, especially on thinner leathers like the one I'm using. If you bought natural veg tan leather and you would like your belt in a different color, we have now arrived at the exciting step of dyeing. A good thing to know is that there are two different types of colorants. The first option is paint. It lays on top of the leather, like the acrylic that I used for my first belt and this pair of bracers. Because it lays on top of the leather, you can use this paint on pre-dyed pieces and sometimes even on chrome tan. Another upside is that it comes in a range of bright colors and it's pretty much what you see is what you get. The downside is that because the paint doesn't penetrate, it might rub off after a while. The other type, which we will be using today, is dye. This is a pigment that seeps into the leather. The color results are a bit more muted and it won't be possible to dye the leather much lighter than the base color. However, it will give a very deep and rich color that won't rub off as easily, and it still shows the pretty textures of the leather itself. One thing to note is that this dye will look darker when you apply it compared to when it has dried, so you do need a bit of patience to see the end result. Another is that dye is a very strong pigment, so you really need to be careful not to spill or get it on yourself. Our skin is pretty much untreated leather, so yup, dye will color it very well for multiple days. Don't ask me how I know. So the materials that are needed for dyeing are something to protect your work surface with. I use a plastic tablecloth combined with baking paper. You need gloves and an apron. You also want something to clean up spillages with, such as toilet paper or old cloth, a small paintbrush, your dye or paint of choice, and if you're using paint, you might want a slightly larger flat paintbrush as well. And if you're using dye, you can either go with a dauber, sponge or cloth. These give different results, which I'll show later. And lastly, you can optionally also get antique gel, which can be applied with an old cloth. About this old cloth that I keep mentioning, Something I really like to use for this is old t-shirts that would have been thrown away otherwise because they have holes in them or something. And I cut these up into squares of 15 to 20 centimeters. It's always handy to have a stack of these next to you when you're working. Once again, you want to test your choice of colorant on a scrap piece first. If you're using dye, you can either use a dauber, sponge or a cloth. Usually I dye with cloth. This uses the least amount of dye and it can give an interesting effect of not dyeing stamped or recessed parts of the leather. It is a quite specific look, so something you should be going for. With a sponge you will use the most dye and have to be careful not to saturate the leather too much, but it is an easy material to obtain and also pretty good at giving an even coat. But today I'll be using a dauber. This is somewhere in between the cloth and the sponge. For the dauber and sponge, simply dip it into the dye and paint it onto the leather, much like using a paintbrush. First in one direction, then cross grain to get it nice and even. Do this while the leather is still damp, as this will make the coat more even. Because I'm going for a wood-like pattern, I'm doing it slightly different and only lightly dipping the dauber in the dye to purposely end up with visible streaks following the general flow of the carved grain. After this, you can also use it to dye the edges. You can dye the back as well, but it will absorb a lot of dye, which increases the risk of staining clothing if it gets wet or isn't properly sealed. That's why I often choose not to, especially for items like belts that touch a lot of clothing. This is the moment you can let your belt fully dry to see how the color ends up. If you want, you can add a second coat. Since I liked the current streaks, I decided not to. But I did grab a paintbrush to touch up the recessed spots that didn't catch color very well with the first coat. And I also dyed the inside of the punched holes. Another fully optional step, but one that can make your carving pop a bit more, is to add antique gel. This is a gel you can generously apply with a cloth and then rub it off again. The gel will stay behind in the more recessed grooves, adding to the shading and the depth of the carving. This is only the second ever piece I used it on. Like I said, it's very optional, but I do think it works really well for this carving. After all of this dyeing, let it fully dry again. Grab a clean cloth and buff the belt. We do this to remove as much of the excess dye as possible. Next up, it is time for one of my favorite bits of leather crafting. We can make the edges nice and smooth by burnishing them. This is an optional step, but I do think it is one of the things that with only a small bit of effort makes your project look a lot cleaner and more professional. If you want to do this very bare bones, you could even do this with just spit and an old cloth, but I prefer to use a tiny bit fancier stuff, which are tokonole, or alternatively, and I never know how to pronounce this, gum tragaganth. You want a Q-tip, a burnishing tool. I like to use these simple wood types, but you can also get bits that attach to a drill to make it even easier. And lastly, something to wipe away the excess, such as toilet paper or once again the old cloth. Burnishing itself is very easy. Dip the Q-tip into the tokonole or gum tragaganth, lightly smear it on the edge and start burnishing away. Once the edge is nice, smooth and shiny, use a cloth or a piece of toilet paper to wipe off the excess. Do be careful where you put the tokonole. If you get it on the front of your belt, it will leave a residue that darkens the dye, so try to keep it only on the edges. With the burnishing, the dye will mix a bit with the tokonole, so also wear a glove for this to not stain your hands. If you did dye the back of your belt, you also want to burnish it. This is the first bit of sealing you can do to prevent it from rubbing off dye on other items of clothing. After all this dyeing has been done, it is a good idea to seal the paint. No matter how well you just buffed it, there is a chance the dye might still rub off on other things, especially when it becomes wet. Plus, having a sealing layer on it protects the surface better from sweat or oils from wearing. For this, I pretty much always use Resolene, but there are other options, which vary in how much they seal and how shiny they end up being. Resolene is on the shinier side, but I quite like the look of it. If you dyed the back of your belt, You definitely want to seal it very well, as it will have soaked up a lot of dye, and this tends to stain your clothing quite easily if not properly sealed. The only extra thing we need for this is the Resolene, which we will thin with a bit of water and then apply it with a sponge. It is best to dilute Resolene before applying, which can simply be done with some tap water. For these types of projects, it isn't an exact science. Thinning it down somewhere between 30 to 50% with water is fine. The most important part of this is to apply it in thin, light coats. Dampen the sponge before dipping it into the water and Resolene mixture, and then squeeze out the excess. Apply this in any motion you want. Just make sure every bit is covered and it doesn't pool in the recessed parts. Make sure there aren't any bubbles. If you see them, go over those again until they're gone. Leaving those on can result in visible circular marks in the finish. I like to apply 2 coats of this and also add it to any bits of dye or antique gel that ended up on the back of the belt to prevent staining the clothes the belt will be worn over. Again, if you dyed the back of your belt, you'll definitely want to apply Resolene to this as well, at least 2 layers. But if the flesh side is rather fluffy, you might even go up to 4. Time for the last big step, which is to put it all together. For this, I'll show you how to do a saddle stitch. This is a stitch with a needle on both ends of the thread. It's a super strong stitch that locks itself into place, so even if a thread would fray at some point, it won't immediately unravel the rest. It might be a bit overkill for the few stitches on here, but I think it looks quite nice and it is a handy skill to have. For this, we will need 2 blunt leather sewing needles, waxed or unwaxed sewing thread of 0.5 mm to 1 mm thick, which is thicker than regular sewing thread, a pair of sharp scissors, a lighter, and an awl, preferably both blunt and sharp, but if you have to choose, get the sharp one. And optional, but it will make your life a lot easier, is something to mark a stitching distance with. I'll be using this stitching wheel, but you can also get something like stitching forks. If you opted to go for a keeper, this will be the first thing we install. The center of the keeper will end up 3.5 cm after the center of the buckle hole. You can subtly mark this in the center of the belt with the sharp awl. If you are using a stitch fork or a pinwheel, put a pin in this hole and then mark the stitches towards the outside. You'll want to leave at least 5 mm between the last stitch and the edge. If you are using a ruler, mark a stitch hole every 5 mm. Use your sharp awl to poke the holes all the way through, making sure to go as straight down as possible. Then align the keeper against the middle hole with the flesh sides of the leather facing together. Try to keep the keeper in its place and flip the belt. Then poke through the holes you marked on the belt, to also mark them on the keeper. Repeat this on the other half and poke the holes all the way through. And I forgot to do this at first, so footage out of order. But anyway, slightly wet the flesh side of the leather at the bits that will bend the most. Then bend the keeper into shape and press it a few times. This makes sure the keeper ends up in a more proper oval shape and it won't pull the belt out of shape either. Then we can get started with sewing. Grab a length of thread which is at least 3 times the width of your belt, plus twice the length of the sewing needle. Better if it's too long than too short. Thread the thread through the needle and push the needle back through the thread 1 to 2 cm before the end. This way the thread will be locked and you don't have to rethread it after accidentally pulling it out. Grab your awl and widen the first stitch hole. Pull one of the needles through till both lengths of the thread are the same on both sides. Next, widen the second hole with your awl. Pull one needle through, but don't pull all of the thread through just yet. Then poke the other needle through the same hole. Before fully pulling it through, check if the thread of the first needle can still move freely. You don't want to have the second needle piercing the thread of the first. If that's okay, you can pull the second needle through and tighten both threads. And that's basically it on how to saddle stitch. Repeat this for all the stitch holes. To keep the stitching neat and even, try to make each stitch as consistent as possible. Always start with the same side, either the top or the bottom, pull the thread in the same direction and insert the needles on the same side of each hole. Stitch the first few stitches this way until you reach the middle hole in the belt. This hole is a single layer stitch, so it won't go through the keeper on the back. Then fold the other half over and continue stitching. It might be a bit more annoying with the keeper in the way, but it should still be doable. When you reach the end, stitch one stitch back to double up, and for the top thread, go one extra stitch so that both threads exit at the bottom. Then tuck the threads under a stitch, trim them with sharp scissors, and if you're using polyester thread, carefully melt the ends with a lighter to prevent them from unraveling. And that's it for the keeper, which means we can install the buckle. To make sure it is secure, we will do one stitch line in front of the keeper and one after it. In general, the first stitch line can go 1 centimeter behind the hole for the buckle, but if you chose a buckle with a very bulky bar, check if that works. You might need to move it to 1.5. The process will be very similar to installing the keeper. Find the middle of the belt and mark it. Then, with your marking tool of choice, mark the other stitch holes and poke those. Then to really form the leather to the buckle, wet the area around the hole for the prong on the flesh side of the leather, insert the buckle and clamp or weigh it down. To not make markings on the leather, I put some fabric in between. Then let it rest for a few hours or until dry. And then we can mark the last stitch line. You'll want to have at least 0.5 centimeter left over of the folded leather on the underside. This may vary depending on the size of your buckle's bar. In my case, there was 7 mm left over between the keeper and the stitch line. Once again, mark this in the middle and poke the rest of the holes. The reason we do this now is because we do need the leather properly folded over, but at this stage, it's not yet in the way like it would be after the other stitch line is done. Then grab your spare bit of leather and use it as work surface protection when you poke the stitch holes through both layers. Do this carefully to have these be as straight down as possible. Do this for both stitch lines. If you have cut your belt in 2 pieces due to the length, this is a good moment to sew them back together. Mark the stitch holes 1 centimeter away from the overlap edge and stitch them in the same way. The stitching for all of these is quite similar to the keeper stitches. Widen the hole and pull the needle through the first hole so both ends are the same length. Pull the first needle through the next hole and then the second needle halfway through to check if you didn't catch the thread. Then pull both threads all the way. At the ends, stitch 1 stitch back, thread the needles under the stitch and finish by melting the thread ends with the lighter. Once you have done this for all of the stitches, you are finished. Congratulations! With this, you have fully made a leather belt. Personally, I found working with leather easier than I thought at first, if you keep in mind that the material isn't very forgiving. So work carefully and precisely, and it will be very doable to create something very pretty. This belt can last you for many years to come if you give it some proper love and care every once in a while, which I also explained in an earlier video that I'll link in the description. If you enjoyed this tutorial, it is one in a series of beginner-friendly costume tutorials. And by now, combining the tunic, pants, cape and belt will give you a pretty good costume basis, so do check those out as well. And with that, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.